Hello, my name is Elijah Driver, and today I'll be discussing the issue of diversity in video games. So, what's the problem with diversity in video games? Since the creation of video game characters have been historically straight white men. This pattern of characterization has alienated a large portion of the market and deters some people from playing video games. This also leads to story issues in games, as it can be more difficult for a game to discuss modern social issues such as sexism, racism, and violence through the lens of a character that simply cannot relate to the issues. It even causes players to lose interest in a story because it's being told from a perspective they've been given dozens of times, causing the narrative to feel boring even when it isn't. I know I personally and several of my friends have all had the experience of giving up on a game because the protagonist was just too boring or too similar to every other protagonist we've seen for us to get invested in the plot. Some key terms you'll need to know for this presentation. Probably the most important is PC. PC stands for playable character. This is the character in a video game that the player controls. A gamer is a person who plays video games, and typically a gamer will play games for several hours a day. Typecasting. Typecasting is the act of placing a character in a specific role because of their race, gender, religion, or orientation. This started in Hollywood and TV, but quickly spread to video games and other forms of media. E3. E3 stands for Electronic Entertainment Expo. This is the largest video game convention in the world, and it's held annually at the Los Angeles Convention Center. So what do the numbers say? 83% of black teens today play video games, compared to 71% of white teens. Despite this, only 9.7% of video game playable characters are black. When we look at gender, 46% of gamers are female. 9% of games, though, showcased at E3 in 2015 had exclusively female playable characters, compared to 32% with exclusively male playable characters. When we look at these graphs, we see that in E3 2015, 9% of games had exclusively female playable characters, 32% had exclusively male playable characters, 46% had both, and 13% were non-applicable. This means at E3 2015, there were more games with non-human playable characters than there were with exclusively female playable characters. When we look at the number of games, there were 76 games presented at E3 2015, and 7 of them had exclusively female protagonists. The bar on the bottom shows us the comparison between exclusively female protagonists and exclusively male protagonists. The graph on the right shows us the percentage of gamers every year that are based on gender. The blue bar is the male numbers, and the black bar is the female numbers. At 2015, the year when this E3 took place, 41% of gamers were female, and 58% were male. That shows a 32% difference between female gamers and female playable characters. This graph shows us the disparity by race, as well as gender. The figure on the left is from 2009. It takes into account all games up until that point. 89.5% of games had exclusively male protagonists, and 10.5% had female protagonists. When we look at the racial breakdown, 85% of games had white protagonists, 9.7% had black protagonists, 3.7% had biracial protagonists, and 1.7% had Asian protagonists. This is also taking into account the number of games where you get to create your own character and choose their race. When we compare this to the number of black teens playing games, or the number of black individuals in the country at the time, the disparity is massive. So, what are some possible causes for these issues? One could be the outdated thought that the primary market for video games is straight white men. While this was true when video games were first developed, the numbers have significantly changed in recent years, with more and more gamers being female, and more gamers being people of color. Another possible cause of these issues is the lack of representation in the corporate ladder. Only 1% of game developers are African American, and only 23% of developers are women. When we compare these numbers to the numbers we saw earlier, there's a massive disparity. And while we know that the notion of gamers becoming game developers is completely untrue in most cases, the difference in opportunity for people of color and women in the video game industry is a really, really significant issue. So what do the experts think about this? According to Beck at Mashable.com, there's a big disparity between the community of developers making games and the audience of gamers playing them. We saw this in our previous slides where we looked at the graphs of female players and female playable characters. And in the last slide where we saw that only 23% of developers are female and only 1% of developers are black. Joe Twist, the CEO of Yuki, the UK trading company for video games, says, "There are not enough game designers from black or Asian backgrounds working, and this is reflected in what we're playing." In regards to typecasting, the game developer Derek Manns says that even when a game does have a black playable character, it's like she's from a broken home, or he's a rapper guy, or he's poor and his mom is on drugs and his daddy's gone. So what are some solutions to this problem? Perhaps the most obvious and most helpful solution is just to hire more female developers and developers of color. This would greatly increase the number of accurate representation as well as the number of games that are representing currently. We also need to discourage gatekeeping and abolish communities like Gamergate that are intentionally harassing women who play games. Lastly, we should make a conscious effort to accurately portray people of color and women in video games, even when it's not the people who are making the games. Thank you for watching my presentation.